Apologize for the technical difficulties earlier on, but we'll begin now. So the death of George Floyd has marked the biggest protest movement in America in half a century. These are protests that are bigger than what we've seen in during the anti-Vietnam War and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And it's over this very brutal killing of a black man that was caught on video. This is what sparked this massive protest movement. For 9 minutes, a white police officer squeezed the life out of this father and member of the community while he was pleading for water, pleading to breathe, and pleading for his life. And after that, the police officers involved thought they could just write a false report and get on with their day. And why not? It's been done before. You choke and kill a black man, you shoot a young black boy in the car, and you just get away with it. Because that's what happens. 99% of killings from the police from 2013 to 2019 have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. Just last year, the police killed 1,099 people. In fact, black people made up 25% of those killed, despite being only 13% of the population. But this murder of George Floyd, this was the final straw that broke the camel's back. In less than a week, America was set ablaze with protests spread to over 200 cities. And to crush these protests, the Trump administration sent in 20,000 National Guards that are now in 28 states. And this brutal murder of Floyd tapped into this seething anger that's been boiling in America, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. While the rich are getting richer, the poor are becoming more poor and more policed. And so that's the anger that we see being expressed on the streets, being expressed with the burning down of a Minneapolis police station, which now 54% of Americans believe was justified. So this shows how this feeling of disgust against the murder of George Floyd and continued police brutality is quite national. Many people feel this disgust. Now, despite mass protest movements that actually started 6 to 7 years ago with the beginning of the Ferguson unrest, nothing really has fundamentally changed when it comes to police killing black people. George Floyd was murdered in broad daylight, and this was being filmed by bystanders trying to intervene and with cops watching over in curiosity. And this murder really exposed the state and the police for what it is: organized violence and terror on workers and youth that has for far too long gone unchallenged. And so the movement expresses this frustration that something needs to happen, real change needs to happen, because we haven't seen it. But behind this massive movement as well is is a crisis of American capitalism, especially after the pandemic. The capitalists, during the pandemic, the capitalists and the ruling class told us that we're all united during this COVID situation. We're all in it together. But while the well-off could afford the best healthcare in isolation, this was at the expense of workers and youth who had no choice but to either return back to work or find no work at all, or suffer from the virus with no means to be tested and treated. We've seen pictures of the rich and the famous being tested with a slight cough, whatever it may be, while frontline nurses have died from the lack of protection gear, PPE. So no, we're not in it together. And in particular, the COVID-19 situation has exposed this gaping racial and economic inequality in America. A report released last month found that Americans are twice as likely as whites, Latinos and Asian Americans to die from the coronavirus. And in some states, they're 5 times more likely. And who are these people that are getting sick and dying? They are mothers and young women working frontline service jobs. They're working regular retail, restaurant, and hotel jobs. They are young people trying to pay their way through college. They are disproportionately Black and colored people. And on top of that, this pandemic has caused the deepest financial crisis since the Great Depression. 42 million Americans are unemployed. That's more people than the population of Canada. And this is already on top of the 2008 financial crisis that has plunged more Americans into employment insecurity and poverty, while the rich are getting richer. The richest 5% of Americans own 2/3 of the country's wealth, while 3 men, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, just 3 men, own as much as half of America put together. And on top of this wealth inequality, you also have the racial wealth inequality, and that continues to grow. One report stated that the finances of blacks and whites is still as wide in 2020 as it was in 1968. And 1968 is the era where people were fighting for political and economic equality. That meant the right for blacks to have, for black people to have good jobs and the right to housing. So nothing has really fundamentally changed. In fact, this wealth inequality has grown to such severe points. And now add into this mix the continuation of police brutality. More Black Americans were killed by police over the last 2 years than Americans were killed in combat in Afghanistan over 18 years. More Black Americans were killed by police in the last 3 years than people were killed in 9/11 attacks. So all of these factors combined, these are what are at the root of these massive protests. The capitalist system is inflicting physical and economic violence on the Black community. I'm going to read a quote from a community organizer in Minneapolis, and this is what he says. It's really a simple question. Am I going to let a disease kill me, or am I going to let the system, the police? And if something is going to take me out when I don't have a job, which one do I prefer? Folks who don't have much else to lose, they understand that the system isn't built for Black people, and that's why people are in the streets. I'm just as likely to die from a cop as I am from COVID. So this again is at the root of this massive protest movement that we see today. Now, these protests have now ignited all over the world, and we see these massive movements, in major cities all over the world. And these protests are not just for George Floyd or, just for the solidarity of what happened in this particular murder case. They're igniting protests that are talking about Blacks and minorities who are killed at the hands of racist police in their own countries. In Brazil, young students are taking to the streets to protest police violence in working class favelas, especially the violence that's inflicted on Black Brazilians. In Berlin, tens of thousands took to the streets against racism. In London, you had a beautiful movement of tens of thousands come out against racism that exists in Britain today and that have killed much more Blacks and minorities during this COVID pandemic. So there are these, massive protests that are happening in countless countries, predominantly led by young people. And, and why is that? It's because they're connecting this injustice that they see in America with what's happening at home. In Sweden, we have seen thousands come out in a protest, not just for George Floyd, but for the racism that we see here at home as well. Massive protests in Stockholm of 8,000, 2,000 in Malmö, and 3,000 in Gothenburg. When the demonstration in Stockholm was over, the police attacked the protesters who were about to take the subway. They attacked unarmed teenagers with pepper spray and batons and threw a 15-year-old on the floor, resulting in a concussion and multiple fractures. So police violence is alive and well in the so-called most equal country in the world. And again, people are protesting here because they see the massive injustice that's happening, the racism and the police violence that's happening in Sweden, and with solidarity with what's happening in the US. Now, violence that the police get away with time and time again, this is what's happening in Sweden. In 2015, 5,600 notifications were filed against the Swedish police officers. However, only 2.5% of them were reported to prosecutors in the form of a preliminary investigation. Police can get away even with murder here as long as they claim that it's for self-defense. And there are also many examples that prove how racism is extremely common in the police force. One police officer told a channel news outlet that she heard colleagues in the lunchroom saying to others that they should round up all Afghans in one plane and fly over Afghanistan and open the hatch. None of the colleagues reacted to this. In 2009, police were caught on camera using racist slurs against youth riots in Malmö, which is predominantly, many immigrants live there. And in the same year, the police in Skåne used racist names as within their internal education. But it's not just these racist views of police officers that make the police terrorize youth in immigrant neighborhoods. It's their role in society, their job, which promotes racist views within the police. They have orders from the top to patrol these neighborhoods. They learn to think that these immigrants are potential criminals. They purposely look for criminality there. And it's not just the racist police itself, but it's also the laws and the judiciary system that protect the rich and punish and terrorize the poor in Sweden. This is why so many young people and workers are protesting today. While parties like the Sweden Democrats are openly racist and anti-immigrant, it's the other groomed capitalist parties that have actually divided up the workers and boxed them off from one another. And it's this current social democratic government that has passed anti-immigrant laws supported by all parties but the left party, and that have passed many laws to show that they are tough on crime. And although the social democrats sometimes admit that crime in poor neighborhoods is rooted in poverty and an increased inequality, they don't do anything to stop this inequality, but instead pass more tougher laws on crime that target youth in these immigrant neighborhoods. It's the right-wing parties and the social democrats that have actually carried out the cuts and privatizations that we see that hit these communities the hardest. And besides the excessive policing of immigrant communities here, immigrants are also disproportionately represented in COVID-19 cases, with more than 4,569 deaths. The Swedish Public Health Agency confirmed that Somali Swedes made up 5% of the country's COVID-19 cases, yet represented less than 1% of its 10 million people. Leader of the Christian Democrats, Ebba Busch Thor, blames immigrants for being illiterate and having a culture where people live so close to each other as a reason why the virus spread so quickly. But that's not what community members are saying. It's not about translating a couple of flyers and posters in different languages and putting them up. It's the fact that the rich can afford to quarantine themselves, whether, with their summer houses or whatnot, while many immigrants live in tight living spaces due to housing shortages and systemic poverty. It's the fact that most immigrants work in service sector jobs and frontline work and can't stay at home. How are nurses, assistant nurses, bus drivers, taxi drivers supposed to work from home? And when they did go to work, it was their bosses with the help of the Swedish authorities who undermined the threat of corona and therefore delayed actually providing adequate PPE. So they went to work and they weren't even safe at work itself. And so the spread of the infection and who it infects mostly has exposed our unequal Swedish class society, and that is the truth. And this is not just in Sweden. This is the same in other Nordic countries as well. Somali immigrants in Helsinki make up 14% of the confirmed 200 cases there. In Norway, where immigrants make up nearly 15% of the general population, they represent about 25% of confirmed COVID cases. And this same ruling class that wants to send more police into Swedish boroughs to terrorize immigrant youth and workers and want to deport refugees out, that's the same class that had privatized elderly care that led to many COVID deaths. It's the same class that carries out massive hospital privatizations and denied workers in the hospital adequate PPE during the pandemic. So it's this very class that is attacking the entire working class. Now, after this massive protest in Stockholm, politicians like Christopher Thompson of the Moderaterna party called the protests idiotic and a surefire way to spread more of the virus. The Swedish Public Health Agency also jumped on the bandwagon and stated that protests should be moved completely online or not at all, as it risks public health. But to this we say the biggest threat to public health are the capitalists and the government authorities who first ignored the coronavirus threat in Sweden, and then when they decided to keep society functioning as normal, ignored the call from workers to properly equip hospitals and elderly care units with PPE. This has led to so many deaths because of their carelessness. And the biggest threat also to public health are the capitalists who maintain unnecessary production, like Volvo cars here, that continue to keep production going, making cars just to churn a profit. They force workers to return back to work, or else they would threaten them with losing their jobs. In fact, at the demonstrations, the protesters were wearing masks, hand gloves, and using hand sanitizer. And they were way more organized in terms of protecting themselves and what the bosses have done within the healthcare units and the healthcare centers. Malcolm X once said, "We're not outnumbered, we are out-organized." The ruling class today is completely organized with its own state, its own armed forces and violence, its own parties. So we too, as workers and youth, must also be organized. The protest movement, without the connection to the labor movement, to the trade unions, to labor leadership, is the biggest weakness and opens itself up to continued repression by the police in America. And the truth is that a labor leadership could organize these protest movements very quickly in their own cities. They can organize self-defense committees to keep killer cops out of communities. And then with that, begin to organize strikes and general strikes to finally end this system of violence. And it's in the interest of the labor movement to do that, because the same cops that are sent down to hunt Black and colored people on the streets are also the same cops that turn up to the picket lines and factory occupations to intimidate and beat back workers. So for the American workers today, for the protest movement we see throughout America, we say that the workers must organize themselves, particularly as an independent force to push forward their interests. Without a workers' leadership, the best this movement can do, like the best that might happen, is some reforms will be put forward, but it might it'll wade back, and it'll be channeled, particularly into the control of the Democratic Party, and their main aim is to keep people off the streets. The Democratic Party is no different than the Republican Party. They're two sides of the same capitalist coin. While Trump wants to mow down protesters with a rain of fire, Joe Biden wants to shoot protesters in the leg and the upper body. So that's how the Democrats and the Republicans deal with this situation. And we can't forget that the Democratic Party and its policies have led to the rampant militarization of the police. This isn't a party for workers and youth. It's a corrupt capitalist millionaire party. And while there might not be a workers' alternative now, there is the ability and the conditions to create that independent workers' party that fights racism, killer cops, and also fights for better jobs, fair wages, better housing, and free health care. In 2016, Bernie Sanders, a self-proclaimed social democrat who ran for the Democratic Party, rallied millions behind him with his call for a revolution against a billionaire class. A large portion of those people were Black and Latino. And though running left-wing candidates in the Democratic Party is a dead end because it is a capitalist party, it showed above all that the masses are not interested in the Democrats, but in socialist working-class politics. And that's the only way forward to check and end this police brutality. Now, the police are the armed body of the capitalist state. Their only function is to protect private property, to oppress our class, the working class. They can't be reformed. They can't be made less racist or, have more Black cops or colored cops. There are plenty of those who've actually killed Black people or colored people. No, the racism of the police is a consequence of their role in society. Their job is to uphold law and order. In a class society, that means protecting the wealth of the rich from the poor. And since they have no good function to us as workers, as youth, as a working class, then we should abolish them completely. And there might be those who say, well, what about crime prevention? Doesn't the police help control crime? The police are disproportionately called to issues like mental health, domestic abuse, and calls of distress, not to mention just patrolling poor neighborhoods and keeping striking workers in check. We don't need the police for any of the above. Trained members of the community, like social workers and counselors, they can answer those calls of distress and quickly solve the problem. Any other issues like murders, for instance, which only represent a tiny fraction of those calls, can be organized through people's defense committees with trained specialists. And let's not forget that the police have a history of not investigating murder crimes due to the fact that the victims are Black, women, Indigenous, or minorities. So having people's defense committees addressing that would be actual real progress. We say get rid of the police and let the people organize themselves, as they've already been doing embryonically in this movement, as we've seen. But we can't stop there to just abolish the police. We have to also get rid of the courts and the laws that uphold capitalist rule, that still contain the legacy of racism and segregation and maintain the protection of private property. We want to get rid of an entire system that flaunts this eye-watering inequality in front of us. We need to fight for another society, a socialist society, and replace that capitalist state with a workers' state. There are many young people that are joining these protests for the first time, and they believe that being disruptive, protesting and marching on highways to shut down traffic will make their voices heard against this injustice. And yes, of course it does. You should yell and shout and march and chant, but young people should also turn to the workers' movement and push the workers to disrupt production, to organize